Um, Welcome everybody, ladies and gentlemen. It's very good to have a meeting. We've had an annual general meeting of the Society back in the summer, but that was purely business. We had to postpone the actual entertainment on that occasion, and we haven't really had a proper Roman Studies meeting since before lockdown. The last time was on the 10th of March when we had that excellent session on animals. So it's wonderful to be able to welcome members and to say that we're actually going to be promoting some Roman studies, which is wonderful and what we're for. And we're absolutely delighted to have Guy Bradley, who is a professor at the University of Cardiff, a Roman historian who is particularly interested in the peoples of Italy, the non-Roman peoples of Italy, who were eventually subsumed under Roman rule during the course of the Republic. He began his work with a study of ancient Umbria, which became a very important book published some time ago. And since then, he's written a great deal about the peoples of Italy generally, about migration, identity, aspects of this kind, and social structures. A very important article on the nature of aristocracy, which I really commend to people. And he also was the editor with Gary Farney of a major volume, a pair of two-volume work on the peoples of ancient Italy, which you may all have seen. And now I'm very pleased to announce that he has published this excellent book, which you might even be able to see, Early Rome to 290 BC, and that's just come out, and is a really important work, and I very much enjoyed dipping into it. And today he's going to talk about an aspect of early Roman history, particularly its relations with the outside world, and he has called his talk Early Rome and the Sea. So over to you, Guy.
Thanks, Tim. Hopefully that's worked in terms of sharing my slides. Could you just give me a thumbs up just to indicate that you see it? Yeah, great. Thanks very much for the invite to speak about the topic of my book and for the intro. It's only fair to implicate Tim, I think, in the genesis of the work through his specialist course on the topic that I took as an undergraduate. And many of the ideas from that course and from talking to him later have undoubtedly worked their way into the book. And I kind of feel like he deserves a share of the royalties, really. But and when Tim asked me a few months ago to give this paper, I readily agreed. My diary at that time, actually, I think it was around the start of September, looked strikingly empty of classes, given that we had no idea at the time of whether we were actually going to be teaching face-to-face or teaching online, or even whether any students were actually likely to turn up. And it's amazing how quickly things have changed over the past few months, how hectic everything's been. So apologies if this is a little rough around the edges. It should be easy talking about a book that's just come out and summarizing some of the main findings of it, but it's amazing how hard it is in practice, actually, when you start thinking about it. And perhaps I should say as well, it's perhaps not the best timing to be publishing a book precisely when bookshops across England are closed for a month. But of course, you can order it online from Edinburgh University Press. I'll provide you, in fact, with a discount code that you may use at the end. I'll reveal that on the last slide as a reward for sticking with me through the whole lecture. And thinking about some of the main themes of the book has been a really interesting exercise, actually. What I'm aiming to do here in this paper is to focus in on one of the key points of the work, which is to show how closely Rome is linked to the environment, to its wider environment. So see whether this works. Let's just push. Moving on my slides, the first slide. The overall aim of the book, or the overall title of the book is quite straightforward. It's part of the Edinburgh History of Ancient Rome. It's the first volume, so it covers Roman history down to 290. So hence the title, Early Rome to 290, the beginnings of the city and the rise of the Republic. It is what I call a kind of Ronseal title. It does what it says on the cover, but obviously my ambitions are a little bit go a little bit beyond just providing a regular history of the period. I'm particularly interested in trying to meet the challenge of dealing with the sources for this period, but also think about particular approaches to early Rome that might help to get round some of the problems. Now, this is, of course, a particularly challenging period due to the nature of the source material, which has a number of problematic characteristics, as I think most people know. Firstly, we can break this up into various different areas, various challenges that they pose. Firstly, it provides a glorified picture of Rome's early history. Secondly, it is the sources are Romano-centric. The focus is very much on the city at the expense of its regional context. And I want to talk about that particularly today and try and address some of those issues. Thirdly, our sources are anachronistic. Early Roman society is seen in late Republican terms. And fourthly, the main historical sources conform to a particular narrative arc, writing, of course, with the hindsight of the rise of Rome to dominate Italy and the Mediterranean. It's very hard for them to escape from the inevitable perspective that brings on early Rome. So my work has aimed to address these issues through various different strategies. And it's up to you really, if by looking at the book, to see how successful you think I've been in doing that. So these are my strategies, though. Firstly, to try and set Rome into its wider context, both its Central Italian context, and also its broader Mediterranean context as well. Hence the title of this talk. And in fact, I'm going to be talking about both the Mediterranean context and the Central Italian context. Second aim, or second strategy, if you like, of my work has been to prioritize contemporary evidence where it's available and to exploit new types of material evidence, particularly archaeological evidence or new examples of material evidence, archaeological and epigraphic evidence, to give us a new perspective on Roman history. And my third aim really is to focus on themes like connectivity, mobility, ethnicity, and to embed them in the overall narrative. So, for example, our key sources tend to be concerned with Rome and not with Rome's neighbours or enemies. And they're not very good at giving us a really rounded picture of the other peoples of Italy, even the close neighbours of Rome, except where they intersect with Roman history, typically where they're conquered by Rome. In addition, they tend to exaggerate the isolation of Rome in order to stress the contrast between early Rome and its later status as a world empire. So Livy, in the context of an ill omen for Tarquinius Superbus, describes the expedition that he sends out to Delphi as traveling through lands that at that time were unknown and over seas still less known. And then also in a famous passage on Rome's first ventures into naval warfare at the time of the First Punic War, Polybius says that it was not that they had fairly good resources for it, but they had none whatever, nor had they ever given a thought to the sea. Now, Polybius is naturally at pains to emphasize the extraordinary rise of Rome from the time of the Punic Wars. And he therefore tends to downplay earlier Roman familiarity with its broader context, particularly with the Mediterranean world. And this is part of what I would characterize as the Roman mirage. Just like Sparta, an archaic state is reconstructed in later sources in a heavily idealized fashion, a moral construct for the contemporary audience. These sorts of attitudes pervade the key narratives of early Rome by Livy and by Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and give us a very Rome-centered view of archaic Italy. Now, until very recently, it was quite difficult to do much about this, but new research has gradually illuminated the wider Western Mediterranean context and the more immediate Central Italian context, particularly in terms of its connectivity. So studies of connectivity in early Italy have really helped from this perspective, such as Stéphane Bourdin's encyclopedic study of the peoples of Italy, published by the French School in Rome, at least covering central and northern Italy, if not the southern peoples, and also by Elena Isaev's brilliant study of migration, mobility, and place in ancient Italy. It's also been aided by new work on Roman archaeology, collected and published by scholars such as Gabriele Ciafani, Charlotte Potts, John Hopkins, Francesca Fulminante, Nancy Winter, and others. A whole series of books that have appeared since 2010 that have really transformed in many ways our knowledge of the archaeological material. Both these trends make a reappraisal of early Rome possible and encourage us to set Rome into its broader context, both Mediterranean and Central Italian. One of the key models developed, therefore, in my book is that Rome is more profoundly the product of its environment than the sources maintain. We can see this from two different perspectives, and this is what I'm going to try and explore in this particular paper. Both emphasizing the connectivity of the city, firstly looking at maritime connectivity and the geographical position of Rome, its involvement in wider Mediterranean diplomacy and also in piracy. And secondly, inland connectivity. So Rome and the Etruscan cities, what's their relationship? How much interchange do they have? The plebeian secessions and related episodes will be my next topic. And then going on to look at Roman colonization and linking it up as far as possible to the practice of secession. And it's to these themes that I'll now turn. So my first theme is Rome and the sea, and I want to begin by talking about the central place of Rome for communication, something that really in many ways is well known. Some of this is environmentally determined and probably happens on a seasonal basis. Rome is on the ancient route, later followed by the Via Salaria from the salt pans of at the Tiber mouth to the central Apennine mountains. It's also on the route along the Tyrrhenian coast, and Rome has the easiest crossing of the Tiber, the peninsula's greatest river, just below the Tiber Island, which is some 19 miles upstream from the coast. Ancient authors such as Cicero emphasized this crucial difference of Rome from coastal cities such as Corinth or Carthage, envisaging Romulus as choosing the site propitiously for the city's future development. But authors like Cicero emphasize that although the city was not on the coast, it still had many of the advantages of a coastal position. Even large ocean-going ships could sail up to the city, as happened with Perseus's royal ship in 167 BC, when it was captured by Aemilius Paulus after the conquest of Macedon and brought up to Rome. We can compare Rome, though, to some of the great South Etruscan cities, such as Volci and Veii. You can just about hopefully make out those places on this map, Veii here and Volci up here. And these cities are much better known archaeologically because we have much better knowledge of their cemeteries. We have a much clearer idea of foreign connections here from their tombs and from their sanctuaries. Veii, for example, is 7 kilometers away from the Tiber and is further inland than Rome. Yet it has had a wealth of contacts with Mediterranean trade. For instance, there are imitations of Euboean pottery made here in the mid-8th century BC, indicating a likely Greek presence in the city. And there also, we find Assyrian products such as rib bowls of a type that can be closely paralleled with the Near East. Vulci, similarly, further north, was another major Etruscan city connected to the sea via a navigable river. Vulci was about 10 kilometers upstream, and yet it has a huge quantity of imported material, particularly Attic vases, found here and dating to the 6th and 5th centuries BC. So the point of looking at those two cities and drawing parallels with them is to point out that riverine connections, and particularly riverine connections to the sea, were fundamental in this period and provide a more ready access to the Mediterranean than might otherwise be expected. These connections manifested themselves in various ways, for instance, in treaties with overseas powers such as Carthage and Massilia. The first Rome-Carthage treaty, for instance, very well known, was reported by Polybius as dating to the first year of the Republic, 509 BC. And whilst there are problems with the historical traditions on the treaties, and particularly between Polybius's and Livy's view, it remains pretty likely, most historians agree, that Polybius is right on the historicity of the first treaty and its date to the first year of the Republic. And the content of the treaty is very interesting because it envisages that Romans might travel to various areas under Carthaginian control, including Carthage itself, the western parts of Libya, Sardinia and Sicily, and conversely that Carthaginians might come to Rome, might come to Latium to trade, but weren't allowed to conquer cities, capture and hold on to cities within Latium. So it envisages not only the presence of Romans in the Western Mediterranean, but also a deep penetration of, potential penetration of Carthaginians in Latium. And similarly, the links with Massilia, modern Marseille, are very interesting. Modern Marseille in southern Gaul, very interesting and important. The first treaty is said to have been formed around 600 BC, and we have that from Pompeius Trogus, when Phocian Greeks founded Massilia, and this treaty was then renewed after the Gallic sack of Rome in 389 BC. In the mid-6th century, Servius Tullius is said to have set up a cult of Diana in Rome in imitation of the cult of Artemis at Ephesus, with Latin consent and funds. We know that from Livy. And according to Strabo, the cult statue was essentially, for this sanctuary, was derived from a Massiliot model, indicating the very close relationship that Rome had at this time with Massilia. Romans also reputedly made use of the oracle of Apollo at Delphi in this period. So in 510 BC, Tarquinius Superbus, a passage I've already mentioned, sent a delegation to Delphi, who were meant to dedicate spoils to Apollo there and also to consult the oracle about the fate of the king. Although it's a very problematic story and involves many mythical elements, Filippo Coarelli has made a very solid case for its historicity, based particularly on the parallels between this visit and the visit of the consultation of the oracle in Delphi by the Caeritans after the Battle of Alalia. A story which is reported in Herodotus and which Coarelli points out is not doubted by anyone. There's no real reason to doubt. There were also reputedly two Roman delegations sent in connection with the siege of Veii, both in 398 before the capture of Veii for advice, and in 394 to offer to give a thanks offering after the successful besieging of Veii. And we know from Appian's civil wars that the Romans dedicated a golden bowl there in the treasury that they at this point shared with Massilia in Delphi. And in commemorating this, the brutal victory that they enjoyed over their rival Veii, Rome seems to be claiming the support of Apollo in this victory, the presiding deity, this famous international center where the Etruscans had long had a presence. So they're making a point within a Mediterranean-wide place, a place of Mediterranean-wide repute where the Etruscans had regularly visited and were well known. Another very interesting area to look at in this context in terms of Rome's connection with the Mediterranean is through piracy. And the practice of piracy by peoples along the Tyrrhenian coast is a really fascinating topic. And there's a really brilliant article on it that I would strongly recommend by Abispum called Roman Antium Pirates, Polities and Identity in the Late Republic. I think it's in the Late Republic. Maybe it certainly covers a lot earlier than that anyway. So Antium on the southern coast of Latium was a very important center. It was a Latin colony from 467 BC and then renewed as a Roman colony from 338 BC. So it's a colony of Rome, but it participates quite regularly in piracy. And the piratical activities of its inhabitants were the subject of complaints by Alexander the Great and by Demetrius Poliorcetes, to whom the Greek states in the East had made representations. You must stop what the Antiates are up to. And they come to Rome to complain because Rome is the controlling power. Now, these activities, the piratical activities on the part of Antium are not officially condoned by Rome, but as Bispum points out, Rome did not closely supervise the activities of nominally independent Latin colonies. Now, linked to Antium may be a figure called Postumius, who we know from Diodorus was put to death in Sicily for piracy. Now, Diodorus calls him a Tyrrhenian, and typically in Greek that means an Etruscan. But his Latin name, Postumius, suggests that he is from Antium or some other place in Latium, or perhaps even from Rome. And this is interesting to think about. How far is actually are Romans involved in piracy? Well, certainly Antium is a Roman colony from 338 BC. And another very interesting aspect to this is the frequent Greek complaints about Tyrrhenian pirates, people they call Tyrrhenian pirates. Now, Tyrannos is typically understood to mean Etruscan and typically translated as that. But as Dionysius of Halicarnassus recalls in two very interesting passages, there's little precision to the use of this term by older Greek writers who used it to designate all of the inhabitants of the Tyrrhenian coast, whether they be Latin, Etruscan, or whatever. And backing this up is a passage from Pseudo-Skylax, a guide to the harbours of the Tyrrhenian coast, dating to quite a considerably earlier period, 4th or 5th century BC, that describes the Latin coast as held by the Latins, the Tyrrhenian coast as held by the Latins down to Circaeum, which is a Latin city. And this raises the intriguing possibility that the many Greek references to Tyrrhenian pirates may include Latins and even Romans. Therefore, there's a fair amount of evidence overall that early Rome was well connected to the sea, and that its inhabitants were not at all the reluctant seafarers presented by some sources. They might be expected to trade in many areas of the Western Mediterranean, such as Sicily and North Africa, and they were also in contact with the Greek diplomatic world through embassies and dedications at sanctuaries. So, having covered that aspect of the talk, I'm now going to move on to look at internal migration and connectivity and consider how Rome fits into that picture. So, second part of the talk, inland connectivity. A wide range of different types of connectivity and mobility were tested in central Italy, encompassing Rome and a complex series of central Italian networks. Stefan Bourdin's major recent study has done a particularly valuable service in collecting the wide range of evidence for interconnectivity in archaic central Italy. So just to cite an example, and this is the reason for putting this complicated looking table on the slide, Bourdin gives us this information about a substantial range of incomers who are visible in the elites of Etruscan cities through names derived from ethnic identities. So, for example, we have 28, I'm not sure whether you can see the numbers actually down on this column, but we have 28 examples of figures who are essentially have the gentilicial name Greek in various different forms, and 91 figures with the name Latin and variants of it from these different places, from Tarquini, Chiusi, Perusia, and from Veii, 41 from Umbria, 8 from Sabinum, etc. What these are is probably migrants who moved to Etruria and formed their gentilicial names, their gens or their clan names from their ethnicity of origin. And the new linguistic environment leads to the adoption of a new name that they base on the place where they come from. And if this is the correct interpretation, then this shows a substantial foreign element in Etruscan society and the interconnections of the great Etruscan cities with other regions of Italy and also more broadly with the Mediterranean. The presence of a large number of Latins is particularly important. In fact, those named Latin are the most common group. And many of them, in fact, we can speculate probably come from Rome, which is a city liminal in its position right at the edge of Etruria. Now, unfortunately, this mobility is harder to see elsewhere, as we lack the early epigraphic corpus that we have for Etruria, and Latins moving to Rome might not need to change their names in this way. Nevertheless, a good case can be made that this is also a relevant model for Rome. It's well known, for instance, that there were many names in the Roman fasti, the list of consuls with foreign origins. Ranui, and in his research sur la patriciat, thought that he could identify 22 families amongst the patricians who were of non-Latin origin, and this is his table of them. Although these are rather optimistic, some of these identifications, and Bourdin in reporting it also notes some criticism of it. Some of the identifications seem rather questionable. For instance, the Aquili, which he names as Volscian, are more likely to be Etruscan. This nevertheless suggests a substantial external element in the Roman elite. And a very interesting parallel has been drawn between Rome and the Etruscan city of Volsini, where we know we have quite a detailed picture of the makeup of the elite through the funerary epigraphy recording the names of people buried in one of its major cemeteries. And Mario Torelli pointed out that Rome in many ways was the mirror image of Volsini, which was an Etruscan city permeated by incomers. We can see this in terms of the names in the cemetery at Volsini, 40% of which are Italic, 60% Etruscan, and the one or two isolated other examples which seem Greek and Celtic in derivation. So as Torelli points out, whereas Volsini is predominantly an Etruscan city with many Italic immigrants, Rome in contrast seems a Latin city with many Italic and Etruscan immigrants. And to back this up, we have a limited but very important range of Etruscan epigraphy from Rome. showing the likely presence of Etruscans in Rome in the Archaic period in the 7th and 6th centuries BC. We have 6 examples of Etruscan inscriptions, 2 from Sant Omobono in the harbour area of the city, 1 each from the Palatine, Capitoline, Esquiline, and 1 from the Cloaca Maxima. And although these aren't numerous, they have very interesting implications. And in particular, the most famous example of them, which is this, an inscription on an ivory lion that seems to be a hospitality token, and which comes from the votive deposit in the Forum Boarium, Sant Omobono. A number of very interesting conclusions can be drawn from it. The inscription on it records the name of, it seems to attest the name of a native of Sulcis in Sardinia called Araz, who is the guest friend of a certain Spurina. And this latter name is a well-known Etruscan name, and the most logical reading of this inscription is that this is an Etruscan resident in Rome who has a relationship, a guest friendship with another Etruscan from Sardinia, and who the hospitality token of whom has been dedicated in this major sanctuary in the centre of Rome. So contemporary epigraphy reveals movement both ways between Rome and Etruscan cities in this era. So with this in mind, it's worth turning to some episodes in early Roman history that tie in with a model of Roman society as open to migration and highly connected to neighbouring areas. Now, I'm not going to talk in much detail here about historical justification of these episodes or not. There's a lot of detail that could be gone into, and I've tried to deal with some of that in the articles that I've written on 1 or 2 of these topics. But I'm happy to follow it up in answer to questions. More critical is the plausibility of the overall model that I'm trying to construct of Romans engaging in this widespread connectivity alongside other Central Italians. Now, the first topic that I want to consider are the secessions of the plebs. The secessions of the plebs in Rome took place in the context of the so-called struggle of the orders between patricians and plebeians, and this said to have lasted from the 5th century to the early 3rd century BC. The consensus of our sources report 3 separate secessions in 494, in 449, and in 287, each to different destinations marked on the map: the Sacred Mount, the Aventine, and then the Sacred Mount, and the Geniculum Hill. All the secessions were marked by the withdrawal of the plebeians from the city, and eventually by the concession to some of the plebeian demands, such as the creation of the tribunate in 494 at the ending of the first secession. That's the canonical version, if you like, of what's going on. But there are many variants and various disagreements amongst our sources, which include the topography of the secessions, so whether they took place to the Sacred Mount or to the Aventine, as is speculated for the first secession. The number of secessions, so other sources talk about 2, 3, or 4 secessions. And also the names and number of the first tribunes appointed. It's also widely agreed that what we have here is a highly idealized narrative of the positive resolution of these political disputes. Unlike Greece, there is no stasis or civil war, but instead, characteristically Roman, there is a peaceable outcome. Now, there have been a variety of different approaches to the secessions in modern works. The historicity of the secessions remains very controversial. Most scholars have doubted the validity of the picture in the sources, and as a result, there has not been much discussion of what the outcome of such a move might be. Typical position is that adopted by Kurt Rafflaub in the 2006 edition of Social Struggles in Archaic Rome. He takes the secession to be in essence a military strike, but he argues that this is implausible in the context of early Rome, which was regularly under the threat of extinction by its enemies. Therefore, the earliest 5th century secessions must have been invented on the basis of the last in 287, which is generally regarded as historically reliable, as it is closest in time to the era of written histories. Now, my own view is that this is worth questioning, and that the secessions are better understood in the context of a mobile environment, and that movement away from Rome is quite plausible in this period. In the context of regular and easy migration, the act of secession implies the potential to up sticks and to move to another place. Secession was therefore rather more than just a military strike, but also a kind of, I've termed it, a paused migration. The plebs leave the city, take up a position elsewhere, but don't go so far that they can't return. In fact, the sources clearly refer to it in these terms on several occasions. In the first secession, Dionysius, in particular, is a very rich source for this, describing the patricians initially as worried that the plebs will defect to the enemy. Once the secession has been established on the Sacred Mount, the plebs remaining in the city begin to individually slip away, openly and secretly. So again, migration to join the movement. Most strikingly, he has the plebeian leader Junius Brutus suggest in a speech that they should leave Rome and found a colony elsewhere, a passage that's worth briefly quoting. Those who took part in the expedition of Romulus scorned the country of their ancestors in the hope of acquiring a better one. But we who are abandoning the life which had for us no city and no hearth are going forth as a colony. On another occasion, an equally striking passage, when further civil strife had broken out in 471 BC, Livy describes the Volsci as aiming to encourage a secession of the plebs over to their side. The Volsci and Aequi lay waste to the fields in order that if the plebs should secede, they might find a refuge with them. Now, recovering the original intentions of the leaders in the secession the first secession is extremely challenging. And how far these analytic views represent 5th century conditions is obviously uncertain. Given that these are speeches or attributed feelings, it would be unwise to take them as firm evidence of the aims of the plebs. Nevertheless, both Livy and Dionysius seem to recognize that secessions could lead to permanent migration to an enemy of Rome. And this is an idea that's in striking opposition to their general construct of Roman history in the 5th century BC, when they see Rome is engaged in a kind of continual battle with its arch enemies, the Volsci and the Aequi, of veritable struggles for survival. And whatever the realities of that historical vision, I think it underestimates the power and the size of Rome. The potential defection of the plebs would nonetheless be a very strange spectre to raise in this context. And in fact, other evidence suggests that withdrawing from a community and transferring to a rival state did take place in the early Republican period on several occasions. For example, there's a very close parallel to the first plebeian secession that occurs a decade earlier. This shows how the secession may have turned out if it hadn't have been resolved. It is the episode in which in 504 BC, the founder of the Claudian clan, Attus Clausus, variously named in the sources, was said to have moved from Regillum in Sabinum to Rome, accompanied by a large number of his followers. He left Sabinum due to pressure from his political opponents over his peaceable stance on war with Rome. Attus was adopted into the Roman patriciate, and his followers were allotted land between Fidenae and a place called Picetia. This district became the Claudian voting tribe later on, and Attus, changing his name to Appius Claudius, becomes a leading member of the senatorial elite and held the consulship in 495 BC. This story is thus not only an archetypal example of the mobility of elite figures and their entourages, because Polybius is said to have been, Appius Claudius is said to have been accompanied by a large band of clients or a group of 5,000 followers, but also I would call it a reverse secession, a movement by seceders into Rome as a result of a political dispute, even if the sources nowhere recognize it as a secession. Now, the tradition on the Claudii probably derives from the family's own histories and is very complex, and just like the tradition on the secessions, has variants and certain problems with it. There are a number of variant traditions, including an alternative date for it under Romulus, which is less commonly held according to Suetonius. And the situation is further complicated by the epigraphic evidence for other Claudii in various different ethnic contexts, including Etruscan inscriptions in Aleria on Sardinia and in Caere in South Etruria, recording the name Clautii, thought to be the equivalent of Claudius. Whilst the name is present elsewhere in central Italy, this doesn't discount the Roman story of Attis's Sabine origins. The presence of Claudii elsewhere, in fact, is paralleled by the presence of other Roman aristocratic families like the Fabii, Aquili, Plautii, and many others in Etruscan and other central Italian contexts, as well as at Rome. Now, some details are likely to be elaborated and debatable, such as the precise number of his followers, Attis's followers. But migration across ethnic borders with a large group of a large entourage is attested by all the sources and fits the late 6th century BC context. Although the stated reasons for the migration are unverifiable ultimately, they show striking parallels with the way that political disputes a decade later at Rome, in the time of the first secessions in 494 BC, at Rome, led to the withdrawal of the worse off party, in this case the plebeians. Another fascinating example in this context is the proposed migration of the plebs to Veii in the early 4th century BC. Livy refers to this proposed move on 2 occasions, in connection with the problematic tradition on the Roman hero Camillus, who is bound up with the whole siege of Veii and this whole period, and the controversy ignited by the suggested distribution of the Praeda Veientana, the spoils of the sack of Troy. The idea was first raised of moving to Veii in 395 BC, the year after the sack of the city by Rome, when the plebeians rejected the prospect of moving to a colony on the borders of Volscian territory and instead favoured the distribution of land captured in Veii to themselves. And the tribune Titus Sicinius is said to have proposed that half the plebs and half of the Senate move to Veii, with the Romans holding both cities together. The proposal was successfully opposed in the tradition, in the literary tradition, by Camillus and by the Senate, and led to the consultation of the pontiffs, who advised the dedication of a golden crown at Delphi, hence the last of the trips to Delphi that I referred to earlier. The proposal was then raised again after the destruction of Rome by the Gauls in 390 BC, only to be thwarted by Camillus a further time, following a famous set-piece speech that Livy uses as the culmination of his first pentad, his first 5 books. Now, scholars have generally highlighted the contemporary rhetorical themes in Livy's version of the story and the ahistorical aspects of much of it. And the idea of the migration has often been regarded as a late invention. In fact, it is a very odd story to invent, and it's actually not at all implausible in the context of central Italy in the early 4th century BC. Rome and Veii were in fact very closely linked by migration throughout the Archaic period, which is unsurprising given their proximity. We know, for instance, of a Latin called Titus Latinus, buried in a Veientine cemetery in the 7th century BC. And we also have literary attestations of a sculptor named Vulca, who is said to have been invited into Rome from Veii in the 6th century BC. Soon after the proposal to move the plebs was rejected, large numbers of Roman settlers were placed onto the conquered land and enrolled in the 4 new voting tribes. In 4 new voting tribes created in 387 BC. So the proposed migration of the plebs is therefore more plausible than scholars have allowed. It occurred repeatedly, and it was only resisted with difficulty. Again, the narrative fits into a pattern of potential plebeian mobility, showing a distinct willingness to abandon the city for better options. Now, my final topic is colonization and secession, an area that I hope to come back to in future research, and which in many ways I have been thinking about for a long time, but also I intend to think about a bit further in a more detailed research project. Now, recent studies of Roman colonization have shown how colonization has formed part of a broader meta-narrative about Roman expansion within a broader picture of the rise of Rome. And in hindsight, colonization is typically seen as a sign of the inexorable march of Roman expansion. Pelgrim and Steck, in their introduction to the recent edited volume, Roman Republican Colonization, shown this very well, and a step on the path towards the inevitable unification of Italy. Colonization was regarded as a key feature of Rome's civilizing mission, and the superiority of Rome's culture to that of the other peoples of Italy is inherent in our story, our modern historiography, our modern discussion of colonization. As a result, colonization is normally regarded as something inherently Roman, an activity that owes little to its neighbors. But in fact, there are a variety of reasons to question this. One is the recognition that Roman colonies, certainly in the early Republic in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, were typically mixed communities made up not only of Romans, but also of Latins, Volscians, Etruscans, and others. Secondly, it's clear that private colonies took place in the later monarchy and early Republican period, probably related to private and clan warfare. As Jeremy Armstrong has shown in his excellent recent book on archaic Roman warfare, the state comes to monopolize mass movement, just as in terms of colonization, just as it comes to monopolize war, but only gradually through a process in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. Thirdly, Roman colonization evolved out of a situation where other societies in Italy were practicing, thinking about, and discussing colonizing type movements, including sacred springs, secessions, itinerant mercenary groups, and migrations such as the Gauls into northern Italy and the Samnites into Capua. These were generally movements typically under the banner of a leading figure, with the participants swearing an oath, as the plebs did on the point of the first secession, and believing that they enjoyed religious protection. And it's also worth considering colonization in this light, Roman colonization in this light, as colonies were inherently related to secessions, something that our sources recognize on occasion. And there's a particularly important passage of Servius's commentary on the Aeneid, where he talks about the idea that secession can shade into migration or colonization, where he distinguishes colonies founded by public agreement from those founded as a result of a secession. Now, to take this a little bit further and to give a few further examples, one example might be the plan to make an armed seizure of Capua by the Roman garrison sent there in 342 BC. Now, this is a very curious episode that almost develops into a secession and has many similarities it seems to be a sort of interstitial position between colonization and secession. There's a complex and very problematic tradition on it in Livy, and Livy alternately calls it a sedition or a secession, betraying some uncertainty about how to classify it. This is an armed group of plebs acting autonomously, and according to Dionysius, they envisage at one point becoming a colony of Rome. Some groups were successful in establishing what we might loosely term a colony, founded through secession, such as the Mamertini at Messana in the 280s, And a similar situation occurred at Rhegium in the toe of Italy in 281 BC, where a Roman garrison called the Legio Campana seized the city and held it for 10 years before being recaptured and punished by Rome. Now, Baillet called these movements armed secessions, a very interesting phrase. And in fact, we have an explicit case of this in Latium at the time of the Second Plebeian Secession at Rome, which took place in the city of Ardea in 443. At this Latin city, the plebs conducted an armed and hostile secession, returning to sack the city. Now, these situations show that secession as an option was linked to the broader context of general mobility and could amount to a real threat to withdraw from the community on a permanent basis and take up residence elsewhere. And this gets us thinking that early Rome, as a result, seems to be marked by a lot of migratory movements, many of which are peculiar and don't easily fit into late Republican categories, although the sources try to see them in these terms. Episodes like the secessions and the putative move to Veii are manifestations of this mobility without its full realization. The threat of moving away from Rome, even to an enemy community, must have been real. It was the result of very severe grievances on the part of the plebeians who had little to lose, or who at least thought that the benefits of such a move would outweigh the costs. A memory of this potential is retained in our sources, even if we're unable to identify the precise means of its preservation. The threat of secession was only averted by the patrician element of the Senate, making very substantial concessions on each occasion, showing how central Italian elites were forced to compromise politically in the face of these movements to maintain the integrity of the state. And it thus helps us to understand how the elites of these states, often themselves a product of migration, might attempt to control or curtail mobility to prevent the potential fission of the community and the subsequent catastrophic loss of manpower. Restraining these movements requires innovative political solutions that create unique institutions, such as the plebeian tribunate with its broad powers and freedom of action. In many ways, Rome can be seen as the most successful central Italian state in resisting the potential mobility of its population and eventually controlling it through colonization programs. So, just to wrap up and to give you a few conclusions, it's worth, I think, drawing parallels with the vigorous recent debate about Roman imperialism, where we have gradually come to realize that what have been called monopolar approaches that take a wholly Rome-centered view are misleading. The connectivity of Rome is in fact a key feature of its success, and also allows us to understand how it is a product of its environment. We can also see the distinctive character of the Western Mediterranean networks to which Rome belonged, encompassing the Tyrrhenian coast, Sardinia, Corsica, Sicily, southern Gaul, and North Africa, this whole district here, and ultimately even further abroad to places like Delphi. These networks operated on many different levels, such as trade, diplomacy, and guest friendship. They also intersect with complex central Italian networks that involve the peoples of the cities of the Tyrrhenian coastal zone, but also those of the mountainous districts to the east. 6th and 5th century Rome should thus be seen in this light as a Mediterranean city, as much as a central Italian city. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Guy. It was a really interesting trawl through a fascinating area of Roman history that is not central to most people's interests in this country, at least. And I think you've given us a view of something that's actually capable of development and of being researched in a more interesting way. I should just say that if to members of the general audience, if you would like to ask any questions, the way to do this, I think, would be to use the Q&A feature. If you look on the bottom of your screen, there's a thing called Q&A. And if you have any questions you'd like to ask, if you could just type them in there briefly, and then I will put them to Guy on your behalf. I think that's the best way to do it. So please do that. And of course, this means that we don't have any questions at the moment, so it gives me a wonderful opportunity to, what's usually an abuse of the chairman's privilege, to ask some questions of my own, or at least to make some observations. Guy, I think the point you were making at the end about the link between secessions and colonization is extremely interesting and has the potential, I think, to be a very productive line of research. That all sorts of movements, mobility in early Italy seems to be linked to these two things, to secession on the one hand, to colonization on the other. The idea that groups could form and bind themselves by oath, which is what the plebeians do, the so-called lex sacrata, where they swear an oath of solidarity to protect themselves, seems also to be what these mobile groups do in other contexts. And you mentioned the institution of the sacred spring. Now, I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about what a sacred spring involved.
Yes, sacred spring is a fascinating Italic myth that is common to the Samnites and various other peoples of central Italy, that involves them following a totemic animal. And it seems to be a response to overpopulation. So it is a ritual that involves all of the produce of a particular year being dedicated to a deity, including the offspring born in that year. And the offspring born in that year are meant to leave the community when they grow to potential adulthood. So that's the Italic myth of the sacred spring, and various central Italian peoples believe that they were founded by a sacred spring, the Samnites from the Sabines, for instance, and many other examples. There's also the sacred spring practiced in Rome, actually, in the Hannibalic War, which we're not altogether sure how closely related they are, but in the Italic world, it seems to be typically a myth about origins that seems to involve a migration of a group, of an age group, particular age group within the community to found an offshoot of the community elsewhere.
Thank you. Well, we are getting some questions here. It's a fascinating question. First of all, from Dudley Miles, who asks whether studies of isotopes and DNA can throw any light on migrations in early Italy. I mean, it seems like something that ought to be applied if it could be. Do you know anything along these lines?
Yes. There are beginning to be studies of this. There's nothing, as far as I know, that directly impinges on the Archaic period, as far as I know yet, although some studies have been conducted in Etruscan cemeteries. Elena Ozaev, in her excellent book on migration, actually refers to some examples from the imperial period where Italian cemeteries have been investigated in this way. And they typically revealed disparate origins of the participants that you wouldn't otherwise know about from grave goods or other things like that. But it's a great question, and potentially this type of research could revolutionize this field. One of the problems with it is quite painstaking to undertake, though, and to actually build up a kind of global picture from it, I think would be that's obviously quite a long time in the future, but it's certainly a good point.
Thank you. Now, Christopher Grocock asks a really interesting and testing question, I think. Starting off about reading back late Republican institutions into the early Roman period. But on a wider scale, what, if anything, do we know about the political organization of other states in central Italy at this early period, and whether Rome was affected by them? I mean, this is actually a really, really important issue.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, actually. I mean, well, we have two sources of information on the other peoples of Italy, both literary and perhaps more importantly, epigraphic. And the epigraphic evidence attests quite a wide range of magistracies used by, for example, the Samnites. They use censors, by the Umbrians, who use magistrates called Eutors and Marones, and by the Etruscans as well. And typically, many of these magistracies, certainly the Umbrian Maronate, for instance, is a dual magistracy. And there has been some speculation as to what extent the dual consulship at Rome was actually based on an Italic or Etruscan precedent. I don't think anything really firm has come out of that. What we do know in the opposite direction is that the Roman magisterial assemblage has quite a decisive impact in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC on Italian societies who enlarged their constitutions in this period, conventionally regarded as a process of the Romanization of Italic institutions.
Yes. I mean, you're right that these magistracies like aediles and praetors and things appear in other Italic communities, and it's long been a question about whether this is just the Italian states copying the Romans, or whether in fact the Roman system owes something really quite profound to its neighbors. I mean, this more than 100 years ago, this was being studied by Arthur Rosenberg in one of the most important studies of Italian history, about the origin of the Roman magistrates. And he argued very clearly that actually there were Italic systems which the Romans are feeding into. And he was one of the first really to understand Rome in its wider context, which is what I'm delighted to see you are doing as well.
Yeah. So it's a good question from that point of view. I mean, I think it would be fair to say we've become a little bit more hesitant about drawing quite broad conclusions like that from the complex epigraphic evidence. And one of the problems when looking at Italic peoples is that their epigraphy doesn't tend to take us back much beyond the 3rd or at the best the 4th century BC. But undoubtedly, many of these institutions exist earlier.
Yes, thank you. Now if we could move to a really fascinating question by Susan Biddle, who asks if there's a significant difference between the way the Republican and imperial sources view earlier connectivity of Rome, either in the wider Italian context or in the wider Mediterranean, according to their contemporary issues. For instance, I mean, she mentions the difference of attitude between early and late, early imperial and late imperial sources, whether they have different attitudes in the same way as the British Empire is being viewed very differently now from the way it was viewed in the Victorian period. So it's a sort of complex question, but about the way in which early Rome was seen by later sources and whether that changed over time.
Yes, that's a good question. And I probably should have thought about this a bit harder beforehand, but I'll certainly go away and consider it. I haven't noticed a distinct difference, but certainly there's quite an extensive study in Lena Azayev's book of the views of mobility and connectivity in Polybius and in Plautus from the late 3rd and early 2nd century BC. And particularly how they characterize connectivity in that period. So I'm trying to draw on what the conclusions
I
would
think
be
part
from
of the
that. I mean, I think
problem,
it's worth saying that it's something talked about by sources in both periods. I don't think, as far as I can discern, that there is a distinct, a clear difference, but there may well be. It just is something I haven't thought about too hard.
I think part of the problem is our sources tend to sort of coalesce in an interesting way on the Augustan period. First of all, our knowledge of Republican sources is so bad, actually. The earlier historians and other sources are only surviving in fragments, really, right down to the end of the 1st century BC. And then the Augustan period, there's this explosion of interest in earlier Rome. And the Augustan sources then come to define what follows, so that all the later imperial sources that are looking back are, if they're doing anything at all, is reflecting on Livy and on Virgil and so on, doing so in their own ways in very interesting. I mean, it's a fascinating question whether that Servius quote that you mentioned about secessions and so on, what Servius being a 4th century scholar who wrote a commentary on the Aeneid, whether there's anything of his own contemporary society and contemporary values that's going into these comments and how you would detect it. I mean, I've no idea what he thought, if anything, about what secession was, for instance.
Yeah, it's a good question, because undoubtedly, writing in the post-Augustan or post-Augustan period, your outlook on the connectivity of the Mediterranean and probably on the connectivity of Italy, described as Tota Italia in many Augustan sources, is likely to be different, or
yes,
could potentially be influenced by those, the different situations. So yeah, it's a good question.
It certainly is. No, thank you. Well, I think
one more question by Rhiannon.
Yes. This Rhiannon Ash, Rhiannon. Why do you think the literary sources such as Polybius were so reluctant to cast Roman her citizens as not shaped by or engaged with the sea? I mean, that is interesting, isn't it? I mean, what's Polybius up to here? And is this a Roman conceit, in fact? Do you think he's just getting that, or is it a very Greek Polybian view, do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Rhiannon. My initial thought about this was that this is bound up with Polybius's construction of Rome and its rapid rise in the period, particularly from the start of the First Punic War onwards. But his great focus, of course, is on 220 down to 168 BC, and the fact that Rome conquers the whole of the known Mediterranean world so rapidly in that period. So that's what he's trying to explain. And whilst he does talk about earlier developments, that's where his main focus is, and he's concerned to emphasize the importance of the period that he's talking about, and perhaps to deny a great deal of any particular importance, rather than seeing a continuum with an earlier period, 5th and 4th centuries BC, to emphasize what's been called the maritime moment of the movement over to Sicily, and the break that represents, and the building of the first fleet in 261 BC, I think it is. There's a very interesting article by Matthew Lee on this, of course, talking about how the maritime moment is emphasized and viewed in our sources. So that was my initial thought about it. But yes, I haven't got much beyond that, really. But it may be part of a wider Polybian agenda. That's certainly possible.
Yes, of course, Polybius has this wonderful story about how the Romans didn't even know how to make a ship. And they captured a Carthaginian ship and took it to pieces and used it as a model of how to do it themselves. I mean, it's very extreme, his idea that they had no clue, and then within a year they were better at doing it than the Carthaginians were. It is. Okay, well, look, if we don't have any more questions, I mean, thank you everyone for taking part in this, and there are people actually now typing in and saying how much they've enjoyed this, and I agree with them wholeheartedly. Guy, it really has been an excellent talk, and it's just so nice to for the Roman Society to get together, even if it's like this in this remote way. And what we can't do, alas, 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 is go to the pub or indeed anywhere to have a drink or to socialize in real time. But let's hope, I mean, yesterday's and today's news perhaps gives us the thought that we may well be able to do so in the not too distant future. And in a few months' time, let's hope we can have a proper Roman Society meeting and that everybody will come along, and we really will be able to celebrate. But for now, I think thank you very much, Guy. I don't know how you register applause, but I think everybody who's attended this would like to do so. So, and these messages are coming through. I hope you can see them, Guy, and everyone else can see them. Yeah. I mean, it's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, thanks everyone for listening. That's been
okay. Thank you. So I think as your chairman, president, I guess I must bring this meeting to an end. So.
Thank you, Tim.
Okay.